by going over how much I've really focused on maximizing the MIDI that can be done with this Korg Nano Key Studio and the VCV Rack patch that I'm calling the Samplifier for now. The goal is to make good sounds from chaos. So it can come from unplanned origins and still sound good, or can be a collection of samples that you already have that you can mix together, remix really easily, or compose and or perform with a minimal set of MIDI parameters causing all the changes and manipulating small amounts, buffered samples, and getting a result. So it all starts with the samples. The upper left-hand corner of this screen shows the Lomas sampler in VCV Rack. I have that basically, I mean, that's driving everything for the most part. Everything has to start here. The settings I'm using right now, I have low CPU mode off, but sometimes I have it on. I haven't really been able to tell much of a difference. Slice mode is on, and the envelope is set to attack and decay. And I find Hermite, if I'm saying that right, the best interpolation. It sounds the best with what I'm going for. I'm also trying to come up with a really efficient way of trimming samples and splicing them in real time. I'll probably end up facilitating most of that when I get into transporting this patch. The next step is to take it in VCV Rack and then migrate it into a Max for Live patch instrument, and then the hardware part would come after that. So it starts with the sample. You can see right now, without any noise, it is going through some different samples. That means the sequence is on and it's actively playing through the sequence, and the way it plays the samples I'll get to in a second, or how it decides what sample it's playing or why it's changing. But it does start with the sample. So if I explain the mapping of this keyboard, I have these buttons set for specific operational functions, like starting the sequence and muting specific groups. So I have 3 different groups that I can mute with these buttons. I'll go into that in a second. And then this mutes everything. So this is essentially just muting groups. The top row is starting the sequence. This is starting or playing the sampler. It's this button, the play button. That's what that's assigned to. So it'll just play the sample if I hit that button. Let me, yeah, so if I I want a lot of control over the samples from the get-go, and so a lot of the MIDI parameters are assigned to make those as malleable as possible. I also assigned the loop function on the Lomas sampler to this button, and the reason for that is the shorter the samples get, the more chance you can have, if you have it looped, for it to create a melodic note from frequency. So I wanted that to be an option. You know, if you have an unruly sample, you can still slice it down to like 1/24th the size and loop that and create something. I'll demonstrate that when I get there to the other stuff going on the controller. The button on the end here is going to be reserved for recording directly in real time to sampling. I don't have that set up for this demonstration, but what I do have is a bank of samples put into the Lomas sampler, and I can go through those with this second knob that I have here, and it's recalling just a folder of samples that I have just randomly laying about. So that's one sample, for example, and I think it's from an old arcade game, but just to show the malleability, that's the basic sample, but I can also chop off the end and loop it if I want. As well as change the note relative to the pitch playing right now. So that's what I meant by making the sample play just a very small slice. It can turn into its own note. It also allows you to have control if the sample has space at the end. And it also, if you invert the playing, you can have it play backwards if you change the start and end times to overlap a crisscross from each other. So so a lot of malleability there and control. This sample bank, or it can be one sample or it can be quite a few. That sample next goes into essentially a playback cycle that is triggered by a clock right here, and that clock is controlled, the speed of which is set to this knob right here. So if I start the pattern,
this report is cruelty. His malice and his will to dominate all life, to rule them all.
I can go so fast that it'll crash the entire patch. All right, hopefully that won't happen again. It's worth noting that sometimes samples, you gotta be careful going through the bank with I'm trying to figure out the best amount in general, but as well as the best amount to pump into the Lomas sampler without having it crash, and also going to have to figure that out again, down the line in Max MSP as well. So what you're hearing right there is actually a song of mine, an older version that it had the whole song. Actually, I think my whole EP is in this one WAV file, or up until this point. So I can understand if it's going to crash. It's because there's some pretty long stuff. But that's what's interesting about this patch, is that it should be able to tackle long waveforms as well as short ones, as far as creating something out of it. With longer ones, you can create more sparse melodies, or there's a lot of malleability there, even with long samples. If you have the right ones loaded up, you can do a lot. It just so happens that it's at a point where a lot of samples that don't normally go together kind of do. So that's why I wanted to run through this stuff. So I went over the pads. I'm going to go over each knob, I guess. This first knob of these 8 changes, and you can see it there. It changes the voicing or the setting of Audible Instruments macro oscillator. And this macro oscillator is treated somewhat like an envelope that the drums and the samples get pushed through during when the sequence is playing. You can hear it on its own. For example, this is fully playable as is. But it also, at the same time I'm playing, the sample, and the mix of the two is where the quote-unquote magic happens, because some of the cool parts about having a set of parameters that you're purposefully limiting yourself to, you're purposefully making it difficult on yourself, or at least as I tell myself, one of the cool parts about this is when I use the same MIDI parameter for multiple things and how that might work together to create just something cool, like something cool will happen because of that. The next button, the second one, is the sample selector. The next one down is the octaver. It controls the octave that plays out of this octaver, because sometimes if I have something that is higher pitch, the drums might take to it a little bit differently. So you can hear it come through in the drums a little bit. Yeah. This is getting hard to explain because I realize it's diverging in its linear elements now. But what happens is I have 2 main signals, and depending on how much I use the nitrous filter from Volt on these 2 guys in the center here, depending on how much is in the mix, you'll hear less or more of the other. So finding a sweet spot in between where you can hear some of the melody from the original macro oscillator as well as the sample that's being pushed and played and manipulated through it, they even if they don't match 100%, they start to match a little bit closer. And if you're into microtonal frequencies, or if you're using samples that are all chromatically linked in some way, it usually produces a pretty good result. The knob here and the knob here, one controls the volume of the macro oscillator as well as the random reset probability. And this is kind of the glue. So what happens is, if I turn this knob further into having more of the macro oscillator in the mix, the sample that gets played will get played much more frequently. So that's useful, but it also binds you. So if you're turning up the macro oscillator, that's because you need more control of the sample, and you don't want it to play as long. So it won't play longer samples long the more you turn this up. The one next to it is how much you hear the sample in the mix to begin with, because you can play without the sample. However, the sample still gets piped, as well as the macro oscillator, into the drums. because the two trummer modules here are taking in specific values that include not only the macro oscillator as part of the source that gets sent into it, but the samples. So that's why if I play back and I have a sample and a macro oscillator setting that seem to be working well together, you'll hear it come through in the drums even though the samples are muted. So let me get the samples going again. You can hear the sample still in the drums there. And the amount that you hear the sample in the drums, as well as the current pattern, the length, and the hits change all on the trackpad to parameters that allow for basically drum fills. So the next thing would be probably talking about how the sequencing happens, because it is currently set so that every 16 beats it'll start over, despite what the Rare Breeds Eugene, which is a Euclidean drum sequencer, despite what that is set to, it'll restart after 16 beats. And this is really helpful to keep everything in line, but still get a lot of interesting rhythm patterns, especially if you control and shift the downbeat to something which I have set as well. So all the sequencing gets heavily influenced by the trackpad. If I'm in the pitch mod mode, which is like more like the performance mode right now, it sounds like this. It's currently playing one snare hit on the Eugene, and then it's 3 rests with a downbeat. So it sounds like this. But on the XY pad, if I just touch anywhere, creates a new variable, and it takes the X and Y values and applies them to the length and the hits. So if we want just 0, nothing, lower left-hand corner. If we want the most, upper right-hand. Tapping the middle will get you something like 7, 16, which is a really good parameter to be able to get back to if you want to create a steady beat. And then if you go back into the pitch mod mode, you can then alter those beats and the length, but it'll snap back to where you have already set it on the XY. That's why I said it's good for drum fills, things like that. And I'll go over exactly how that, because that was the most difficult balancing act of the whole show. The touch scale button is a quick way. Right now, there might be a better one, but it helps me set the downbeat where it's going to go. So you can see all the values I assigned and how I assigned them here. And then in VCV Rack, anything with these little yellow dots is what's being controlled. And I'm covering up the actual what's changing here because I thought it would be easier to see with me talking about it than having to read the tiny print. It's a great program, but sometimes it's really hard to read some of the modules for whatever reason. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. explain the touchpad because it's probably time. There are a lot of things get manipulated by the touchpad, and you can see the pitch wheel output and mod wheel output go to a lot of things. I'll actually hover over these for a little bit longer. So it's affecting the delay, tone, mix time, and feedback, as well as the length on the pitch wheel. And then on the mod, it is affecting the mod's the y-axis, the pitch is the x-axis, by the way. But on the y-axis, it is affecting the shifts, which should it be affecting the shift? Well, it isn't right now, at least. It's affecting the hits, and then as well as the inputs for how dramatic the change in the drums is. It creates a longer decay on the snare sound. You'll hear more of the sample cut through. And then the tuning, as well as some other factors, create a variant that is cool for drum fills and expressive movement, because this thing needs to be good at expressive qualities in the end. So the touchpad is where everything is centered as far as the performance and So, the third group is the hi-hat and delay, or maybe it's just the delay now. Well, what it is the delay is heavily affected by the trackpad, and how dramatic the trackpad is as far as the scope. I don't have any perfect spot, but I usually set it to 5 semitones or an octave. It depends. Sometimes one works better than the other, but both work pretty well. So that's all like the main components. The sustain button doesn't invert on the drums. And that's the newest addition I've made. Oh, and the last thing I'll add in this version of this explanation, at least, is that you can see it scrubbing through samples. It's doing that. If you look at the attack here, it is connected to the envelope out. I love these Volt Trummer drum synthesizers. The envelope out is going to the attack, and what that's doing is messing with the speed of the playback. And also, if you look here, the envelope output of, let me make sure it's the right one, yeah, of the second part of the trummer, because there's two different sides, the oscillator and the noise. The second envelope, the noise envelope, is going into the sample. So what that does is it cycles through a few of the samples really fast to create the attack for a kick. Because these trummers can take in source material and mesh it with the overall output, as well as create an envelope from their meshing that you can then feed back into the things that it was creating it from, which is the sample. I'm creating this recursive process where I have a kick drum and snare that are very much, you know, there's a little bit of white noise in there. There's a little bit of speed and attack variability and sample selection, all going into creating this unique sound that then rests on something familiar. The only thing I haven't probably honestly done a good job of making part of the sample, because everything you're hearing is derived initially from the samples, a little bit of oscillation and white noise, and the envelope that's optional in the macro oscillator. All those things are easily, you know, manipulated in a way. I wanted this to be so that if you took any sample and you came up with a cool beat, if you changed it to a different sample or set of samples, you'd have a cool beat with all the same parameters, but it sounds totally different. And the only thing that is there that is totally cheating in my philosophy, is the hi-hat, the VCV Rack hi-hat, which simply enough, I mean, it's still taking in so many parameters that are outside of itself to create the hi-hat sound, but I needed something that was consistent and always on the backbeat, so it's set to the quarter note output of the JM clock. Yeah, so that's the long and short of it. I know it still sounds kind of chaotic, but let me see if I can really quickly demonstrate something like I was just saying, where there's one sample that drives a whole different vibe, and then you can change one knob and it's a whole different vibe again. So let me see if I can get something.